Hello and welcome back to my channel. Bonsoir et bienvenue sur ma chaîne. My name is Muriel and this evening I will be doing the first part of a two-part mini-series of videos examining and comparing the novels Lolita by Vladimir Nabokov and My Dark Vanessa by Kate Elizabeth Russell. In two parts because at first I had only decided to do a comparison/analysis video of these two novels because I have recently reread them, but I have new thoughts, especially about My Dark Vanessa, and to make it easier, I decided I would do a video about my thoughts upon rereading these two novels and then do a video going into the comparison proper. I will also in this video be giving a bit of context as to why I decided to do a comparison video for these two novels. One, well, because they are compared to one another a lot on the internet. When My Dark Vanessa came out at the beginning of this year, everyone was saying, oh, it's the newest answer to Lolita, or it's Lolita told from the point of view of Lolita, it's the new iteration of that. And I've seen a couple of people doing comparisons of these two novels on BookTube and numerous comparisons on Goodreads. And I actually think they're fairly different novels. That's also why I want to give my thoughts on this particular topic. Because sure, you can compare them and there are obvious parallels, but they are also, in my opinion, very different novels trying to do different things with their stories. Two, I decided I was going to reread Lolita and My Dark Vanessa because if any of you have seen my original review of My Dark Vanessa, you will know that I principally read these types of novels because I experienced something very similar. I was in an abusive relationship with a man who started out as my teacher between the ages of 13 and 20 years old. And, well, there have been actually recent developments with that story, and I'm dealing with it. But one way I deal with shit in lieu of actual therapy, which I'm also investing in any case. I read books, I read nonfiction and novels, and I try to process stuff largely on my own. So yeah, I decided to revisit both of these novels to look at the psychology of the predators more specifically and try to work things out. So that's the background info as to why I decided to do these couple of videos. Now that that's out of the way, so like I said, if you're not particularly interested in me revisiting my thoughts on these two novels, you can just skip ahead to part 2 where I'll be going in depth into the comparison between the two. Let's start first. So I reread Lolita 2 weeks ago. It was the third time I read it, my second reread. It is still, in my opinion, a masterpiece of English language literature. It is still one of my favorite novels of all time. It's my favorite non-SFF novel of all time. Each time I reread it, I discover new things or I have new thoughts about it, which I think is normal, especially with great works of literature. Most of the things I said in my original review, which you can check out if you wish, are still applicable. I haven't really changed my mind on much. And yeah, I'm not going to explain the plots of these novels again. I'm assuming you already know what they are about. And like I said, you can check my original review. So I'm going off of the idea that you're aware of what I'm talking about here. So concerning the character work, in my original review, I said that Humbert does his best to make you feel sorry for him, to sympathize with him, to understand that there are mitigating circumstances to what he did with Lolita, etc., etc. I still believe that. I do want to make it clear though, and I already thought this when I did this original review, that if you're a decent person, well, I mean, you do see through his game, right? And there are definite cracks in the story itself where you see Lolita crying herself to sleep every night, and she's clearly in a nightmare situation. But I mean, even so, Humbert tries to justify himself, but if you're a decent moral person, you know that what he does is wrong. It doesn't matter whether or not Lolita was seductive as a 12-year-old. It's wrong for an adult to do that with a person that age. So it's not so much that I changed my mind on this. I just want to make clear that that was already my opinion, and that should be clear to the average reader. Like, you can get taken in a bit by Humbert's explanations, and you can still feel some measure of empathy, because that's the whole point, is the author puts you in his head and you're a human being and you can understand another human's being emotions, because he's not a sociopath, he still has emotions. He's a pervert, he's a predator, but I don't think he's like a sociopath. Psychiatric diagnosis, am I right? But no, I don't think he's that kind of like crazy and repulsive. He is a predator, but not a sociopath. So you can understand his psychology to a certain extent, but you will still, again, if you're a decent person without that type of paraphilia, you'll understand that what he's doing is wrong and repulsive, and you'll feel repulsed that you might feel a smidge of sympathy for him. So I just wanted to clarify that. More interestingly, though, I do have additional thoughts about themes, because in my original review I said there were just like maybe a couple of themes, and I talked about the cultural clash between old Europe and new America, and specifically like the consumerist capitalism embodied by the America of the 1950s versus the like cultured refinement of old Europe and its culture, its literature, its artistic tradition, etc. I do want to add a couple of things though, because I also think that Lolita takes a look at what I'm going to call the sublimation of perversion and or evil through art, through literature, because that is kind of what Humbert is doing with this story he's telling the reader. He's trying to give his tale a poetic spin and trying to make something beautiful out of the horribleness of what he inflicted upon Dolores Hayes as a young teenager. Because I mean, there are a few passages where he says, I'm not a pervert, or I'm not just a pervert, I'm a poet, and I'm not just, like a vulgar rapist who would attack a child on the school playground. No, I try to educate her and elevate her above her, well, vulgar Americanness, I guess. So yeah, I think there's that idea of making something beautiful out of something horrible, ugly, evil, painful, etc. And then additionally, and this is something which you also find in My Dark Vanessa, but I'll get back to that, it might not so much be a theme as like a running thread of conversation. Who gets to tell a story? Who gets to immortalize people or entrap people within a story and fix them in a story or a work of art and just capture one single image or one single narrative about a person in the story? Who gets to do that? Who gets to own the narrative? This is, of course, explored maybe more in depth in My Dark Vanessa, but I do think there is a bit of that going on in Lolita as well, because Humbert is the one telling you the story exclusively. He's an unreliable narrator, and the only image of Lolita you'll ever get is the one, well, fixed in his mind's eye forever. And there's like a point, I don't want to spoil this, but basically towards the end he says something akin to the fact that, well, he's immortalizing her and their relationship through his written story. And so, I mean, in a way, he's paying homage to her, but he's also owning the narrative. He's stealing her voice. And so you're participating in that a bit as the reader. So that's also a bit uncomfortable. It was important to add these two, like, themes, threads of conversation, because I did find those in the novel and I hadn't mentioned them in my original review. So yeah, additional thoughts. Maybe I'll have newer thoughts the day I reread it for the third time, who knows. But yeah, I mean, I still very much enjoyed the experience of rereading it. There's such a strange atmosphere to it, or a strange atmosphere I encounter when I go into the novel. It's very hard to explain. I think I said this in my original review. Lolita just reminds me of the color grey, the kind of grey you have with an overcast sky, pregnant with rain, but the rain just won't fall. And there's something so sad and tragic about it, but also beautiful, like high-strung violin music. I know, I'm going off on a tangent, but I always feel this when I go into Lolita. It's an amazing work of literature. Then when I was done with Lolita, so I reread My Dark Vanessa, and that was my first reread. So I've now read it twice. The first time I read it, of course, was, well, at the beginning of the year. So about 6 months elapsed between my first and second read-throughs of that novel. So again, most of what I said in my original review, which you can check out if you wish to do so, are still applicable overall. Of course, that review is a bit different because I inject a bit of commentary on my own experience, because, like I said, I experienced that kind of relationship. Not something like in Lolita, she made like I was never kidnapped and driven around the country for a year. It was more like a grooming situation, like in My Dark Vanessa. And My Dark Vanessa is to this day still the novel that comes the closest to telling a big part of my own life story, which is weird. So I injected a bit of commentary about that in that review, and that's still largely applicable, though even that has evolved, because, like I said, the situation has evolved. But, so upon reread, I did get annoyed more at what I read, a lot more nitpicky, a lot more critical. I did end up downgrading it. Originally, I had given 4.5 stars out of 5 on Goodreads to it, or like a 9 out of 10 in my own rating system. I would bring it back down to 7.5, or like a 3.5 stars on Goodreads. Because they're just flaws I cannot ignore, despite how personally relevant it was, despite how important I do believe the themes are. So first, the writing. It's just not that well written overall, especially if you compare it to something like Lolita. Now, again, like I said in my review, I didn't expect it to be on the literary level of Lolita. So it's not that big of a deal. But it's just, even for itself, it's not that well written in my opinion. It was apparently a PhD thesis. Hey, I don't write. I mean, I do write, but I don't write books. I am not a professor of literature. I'm not going to be too judgmental about that, but I was a bit like, really? So take that as you will. But there were a lot of repetitions, what I thought were authorial tics. She uses a formula to talk about traumatic dissociation and just uses it too goddamn much. I'm sorry, it was like, could you please change the bloody metaphor? Like, we get it, she flies out of her head. Like, can you change discs here? Seriously? And just tics of laziness? I'm sorry, I know I'm sounding mean right now. It's her debut novel, so there's room for improvement. But X'd out to describe exiting a window on your computer. X'd out. Really, I'm sorry, but that's lamentable. It is lamentable in a novel that got a PhD. There are words in the English language you can use, but X'd out for an adult novel of contemporary literature. I'm sorry, that's unforgivable. Does that make me a snob or an elitist? Maybe, but you know what? I don't care. It annoyed me. Then moving on to the characters. Here again, I just couldn't escape from the fact that the character work just isn't that good overall, actually. I had a problem the first time around with the characterization of Vanessa Y. So she's the main character who tells the story, also somewhat of an unreliable narrator like Humbert, except this is the victim and not the predator. I couldn't really put my finger on it the first time around. I said, like, the characterization is decent, but something bugged me about it. And now I know what it is. I know how to name it. The author tells you who Vanessa is. She doesn't actually show it to you in the narrative she's constructed. And that to me was a huge problem. You hear that Vanessa loves literature, that she's maybe an intellectually gifted child, that she's precocious, she's in all these advanced placement classes, she has this rich inner life. You don't really see any of it. And another problem I had with the story is that you start off when she's 15 and move on from there. They're like just a couple references to her childhood. But so the way she reacts to things, the way she gets upset or happy about things, there's like no background context for any of it. Who is this person? Where does she come from in a way? Like, how was she as a child, as a younger teen or tween, like when she was 10, 11, 12 years old? How did she get to a position where she was like super attracted to an English literature professor? There's like a whole chunk of her that's missing. And she's the main character and it's 360 pages. There's space to flesh this stuff out. I'm disappointed that the author didn't. Now, conversely, it did allow me to insert myself in the place of Vanessa somewhat. So that was cool for my personal experience. But more generally for readers, I don't think it's quite good enough. I will say that from the little you're given about Vanessa's personality, I did identify with her more than I did with Lolita, from what you understand is Lolita's personality in that novel, of course. Vanessa does seem to be like a bit depressive, maybe intellectually gifted, precocious. She doesn't have any friends, which were all things I experienced myself, which probably contributed to the fact I was groomed as well. But like, her entire personality is reduced to her relationship with her teacher. Some people will say, well, yeah, she was groomed, she was traumatized. I'm sorry, but Again, I know what I'm talking about here. That's not a good enough explanation. I was molested as a child, and I was groomed as a teenager into my young adult years. I was still my own person. I still had my own hobbies, interests, passions. I kept diaries. I read books, lots of books, and books that had nothing to do with my teacher. I was my own person. I've always been my own person, even though I've been through emotional/sexual trauma and abuse. Where is any of that with Vanessa? There's something very empty about her, shell-like almost. And then when it wasn't a problem of her being too shell-like, she contradicted herself so much. And I was like, but is this truly what the character Vanessa would think? Or is this what the author thought was right to say, given what she presumably read about trauma theory and, I don't know, psych textbooks? I'm not sure. It felt a bit clunky at times. You can be contradictory within yourself. I'm not saying that's impossible for the human psyche. We're all different. We've all developed in different ways. I'm just saying that based on my personal experience of life and of that kind of relationship, it felt off. It felt off and not as well realized as it should have been, in my opinion. And then finally, a note on, is it a question of structure? I'm not really sure what to call it. It doesn't have to do with the themes, really. It's about, the scenes of traumatic dissociation associated with sex. Again, it might be a minor quibble for some people, but like I said, I'm basing this a lot on my personal experience. I am also basing this on stuff I've read, mind you. I've been reading about trauma, sexual abuse, etc. Traumatic dissociation is a very real thing. It doesn't happen systematically, though, in instances of like rape or grooming or sexual assault. But from what I've read, it seems that the more violent actually the incident is, the more likely you are to dissociate, because it's a survival mechanism of the brain. It's useful to have, but of course, unfortunately, it has terrible consequences for your psyche and your mental health and your recovery. So given that, I'm a bit confused, because there is an instance, of course, everyone's going to say she was raped all the time, but so whatever. The sex she had with her teacher, not all of it, like I said in my original review, was violent. There is an instance of violence the first time she has sex. I'm not convinced, though, that would trigger traumatic dissociation. I add this also because, like I said, it had bothered me the first time around, by the way. I did mention this in my original review because I felt it was too formulaic, too stereotypical. The way it was described seemed a bit nonsensical because she pictures roots going into the ground and her baking bread with the mother, and I'm like, zero context for that whatsoever, which goes back to the problem about there being no personal history context for Vanessa White as an individual. But I noticed this time around, this shit starts way too early. She basically flies out of her mind when she's looked at intensely, or when she's like touched on the knee. I'm like, oh, come on. That's a wee bit ridiculous. I'm not saying you should be touched against your will, by the way. I'm all for consent. So don't put words in my mouth here. But really, you're gonna dissociate because someone pats you on the shoulder? Are we really going to go with that? Or because someone looks at you like suavely, like, ooh, I'm trying to seduce you here. Ooh, boom, I fly out of my head. Really? I'm sorry, that's bullshit. You're gonna stop that there. Like, not even when she's having PIV with the dude in his bedroom. No, when he's looking at you in the classroom. Because you're that flighty? I mean, what the hell was that? I'm willing to admit that could happen, perhaps, if the person has already been abused and traumatized them. But there's nothing to suggest that in Vanessa's story. She had a relatively normal childhood. I guess her relationship with the parents isn't great, but it's far from being abusive. So there's no justification for that. Again, it's like, it felt to me as if Miss Russell just read a lot about trauma in, I don't know, medical psychology textbooks and just did her damnedest to fit that all right into the story she'd already kind of created years before. And so the end result kind of feels disjointed and clunky at times. And again, I'm going to pull the personal experience card, but yeah, I never had that. Well, at least not that I can remember. I didn't have traumatic dissociation. You can be raped and enjoy the sex, I guess, is kind of, I mean, it's a complicated conversation. I'm not going to get into it. But you don't even need to make it that overtly traumatic to point out that it's grooming and that it's harmful. But even then, even if the sex is a bit rough around the edges, as it is the first time at least, and maybe a like once after that, like when she's much older, like when she's an adult. But this thing of like having her dissociate quite violently from the get-go when she's looked at in class, that's just ridiculous. It makes it not that credible. I'm sorry. It's like you're trying to explain that it's complicated and grooming and trauma, it's complex, but you're just going so overboard with this shit that it becomes unbelievable in a way, or at least to me, who went through something similar. So I'm like, all right. Otherwise, my thoughts about the themes are more or less the same. I do think that's the strongest point of the novel. The themes, the conversations, it has started, it will start. The portrayal also of complex feelings with regards to these types of situations, how victims in this scenario don't always see themselves as such, and it might take several years before you start to unravel the trauma and the abuse that was inherent in the relationship, because that was literally my case. I'm still not comfortable at all with like rape victim, grooming victim, but that's technically what it was, and I was harmed by it. So see, this shit's complicated because it touches very personal, intimate parts of yourself. So that is very valuable in My Dark Vanessa. I'm just saying that as a work of literature overall, there's some serious flaws and it could be done better, basically, I think is what I'm trying to say. So yeah, I had to downgrade it, unfortunately. So basically, those are my updated thoughts for Lolita by Vladimir Nabokov and My Dark Vanessa by Kate Elizabeth Russell. Feel free to refer to my original reviews. The one for Lolita is really almost 100% still applicable. I just added a few things. The one for My Dark Vanessa is still largely applicable, though I did update some of my thoughts and felt my criticisms back then are even more justified now. Like they were even more apparent to me the second time around, and as such I just couldn't justify giving it the very high rating I originally did. So there you have it. So next I'll be doing a proper review, going like through each category, writing, characters, etc., to give you an idea how they overlap, in my opinion, but also how they differ quite well significantly. Yes, I do believe that. Until then, I hope you will have a lovely day or evening, and I shall see you very shortly in the next video. Bye-bye.